that you would like to discuss before we move ahead? Take a moment to think about it. Yeah.
I was looking to mention that the Industrial Revolution and the ideas that came essentially from Newton penetrated Europe in the 1750s and here in the 1850s. If it takes that long for new ideas to penetrate the social system, when do you expect these ideas to be
very good. Great point. Renaissance took 200 years. What Ortega y Gasset showed is that each successive revolution takes less time than the one that preceded it. So that the Christian revolution that occurred in the Western world took more than 200 years. It took almost 400 years for the conversion of the Western world to Christianity from paganism of various forms. The best we can do now is estimate that the current conversion will take probably 100 years. The earliest you can date it to, the first sensing to this you can get, is in the 1950s. So it says we're maybe about halfway through. But it's not a line. It's an exponential growth development. The resistance to it is something I'm going to discuss because the resistance is internal to corporations. I'm going to show you where that resistance comes from and what can be done about it. So we can literally accelerate this transformation by understanding the need for it. And that's really what I'm talking about. Or you can let it happen to you. We do work in the so-called urban black ghetto, just north of the university. We've been there for 40 years. This neighborhood has made an incredible conversion. It's been the subject of 7 national television programs. Their process of self-development is now used in 62 cities in the United States. And they have a slogan. Well, absolutely marvelous. I used it in one of my books. It's the frontispiece. Plan or be planned for. And that's what confronts corporations. You can let it happen to you, and you'll probably fail or be absorbed if you do, or you can take the bull by the horns and lead the parade. Okay? Yeah.
What's the relationship between nationalism and transnational corporation in your model?
Well, that's a good question. When we start to look at a community, it becomes clearer, since every community is a part of a larger community, and the larger community always has a major impact on the performance of any community, that you can't stop at the boundary of a nation. You could when transportation and communication was limited. But the fact is that business is now international. It's no longer national. The bulk of business is now conducted internationally. So our political structure is not informed for the actuality of the transactions taking place. We have to redesign society, and that's what my last book is about as well. Just as we have to redesign the corporation, we have to redesign the society. Let me just take a moment on that because it's such a critical question. Peter Drucker, who is responsible for so much wisdom, once made a marvelous statement that there's a difference between doing things right and doing the right thing. See, doing things right is efficiency. Doing the right thing is effectiveness. So you can do the wrong thing right. I can raise the question, if I want to wipe you out, what's the most efficient way of doing it? See? But is wiping you out the right thing to do? They're separate questions. Now, the implications of that, we've begun to realize, they go as follows. The righter you do the wrong thing, the wronger you become. Okay? If you do the wrong thing right, if you do the wrong thing wrong and correct it, you become wronger. Therefore, it's better to do the right thing wrong than the wrong thing right. Now, what's that all about? Every major social problem confronting this country today derives from doing the wrong thing righter. Every one of them. And we don't have time to go into that. I mean, that's what my book is about. Let me just take one quick example. Take crime. Do you know the United States has more people in prison than we have in all the colleges and universities put together? We have the largest percentage of our population in prison of any country in the world and the highest crime rate. Something's fundamentally wrong. It's not a question of building more prisons and upping the police force. That only makes the problem worse because it's the wrong thing. The criminal system is devoted to get revenge on people who commit a crime. The result, criminologists have shown that every time you send a person to prison, they got over a 90% chance of coming out. And when they come out, they have a higher probability of committing a crime than when they went in, and it will be a more serious crime. Prisons create crime. We've got to make a fundamental change in our concept of how we treat criminals. That's redesign of an essential part of society. Now, you can take any institution. Healthcare is a marvelous one. It's so irrational, it hurts to think about it. What do you pay a doctor for? For taking care of you when you're sick, right? It's a sickness care system. That's not a health care system. How does a doctor make a living? By keeping you sick. We can show, just yesterday, there's a study was produced that shows over 50% of the people who die in the hospital die because of something that happened to them in the hospital. Over 1 million people a year are seriously infected when they're in hospitals. Over 50% of the surgery is unnecessary. More than 50% of the tests, and you go on with all these statistics. Why? Because you pay the system for taking care of you when you're sick, so they maintain and produce sickness. It's an irrational system. So you say, how does this affect society? We've got to start to think about society in rational terms, just the way we think about the corporation. Okay? Okay?
You mentioned that a number of ideas came out of Bell Lab in I think it was the 50s. Why do you think it took so long to implement those ideas? A lot of those ideas...
Mostly technology. Most of it was technology. I had to wait the development of the transistor, of satellites, communication satellites, and so on. The first mobile phone that we produced was actually a broadcasting station, and your receiver was a radio. So it had a range of about 50 miles. And it wasn't until we had satellites and go up and down again that you could get the current phone that'll operate worldwide. So a great deal was technology. We have phones that we've developed that are not commercially available now. One phone in particular cost $350 to build. But it's amazing because it hangs around your neck and it's just a little thing here and you can talk anywhere in the world without the use of your hands. If you call me while I'm talking to Paris, and I've done this, I can continue my conversation with Paris, but deliver to you in my voice 5 different messages by pressing 5 different buttons. One will say, hold on, I'll be with you in a minute. The other one, hang up, I'll call you when I'm done, and so on. I mean, that all exists, but we don't have the technology to do it in an economically feasible way yet. So it's the economics and technology which requires slow growth. Now, in the case of AT&T, there's an important second reason. It was deregulated, as you know, and Bell Labs went to hell. Bell Labs is no longer the leading research institute it once was. Yeah.
I'm interested in your comments about keeping the workforce as a social obligation. I've heard both Gates and Welch say they need to get rid of 10% of their workforce each year to keep it fresh and competitive, and others too, I guess. I'd just be interested in your comments on that.
Well, they're wrong. That doesn't say they have to keep them employed. What they have to do is see that they are employed. You see, General Electric didn't keep those people employed in that factory, but it made sure that their employment continued. Clark didn't keep them employed. On the other hand, Alcoa, Tennessee, which is the largest Alcoa thing, had to downsize, so-called. But what it did was create a construction firm to do the repair and maintenance on the plants that they had. And those companies that were created took the employees that were moved out of Alcoa And now they were available for doing maintenance and repair work under contract for other companies as well. So all I'm saying is there are always ways of maintaining employment. It's easy to say we're going to downsize by this percentage. The stupid thing is it won't help. It will hurt in the long run. But managers operate by the short term, not by the long run. Of course, as you know, the bonuses talk about irrationality. You tell a manager you want them to worry about the long term, but give them a bonus based on quarterly performance. So what's he going to worry about? Cooking the books. It's the system that's responsible for the distortions and theft today, not individuals. It's like cheating in school. Cheating is a result of the stupid method of education, not the dishonesty of students. Yeah.
Russ, you talk about this issue of downsizing or taking things offshore, pick a name for it. Isn't it really an admission by the leadership and management structure, primarily the management structure, they don't know how to manage their own business?
Yes, that's exactly right.
I mean, because
If they did, you wouldn't have corporations that live only for 11 and a half years, That's terribly short, 22 failures for every survival. They don't, they think they do. And the trouble is the business schools. It's the educators that are responsible. When I retired from Wharton, it was compulsory because at that time the law was at 65, you had to retire. Well, the Wharton Journal asked me to write an article about my life as a professor. So I endeared myself to the faculty by saying Wharton did three things. The first thing it did is it gave every student who graduated a vocabulary that enabled them to speak with authority about subjects they did not understand. The second thing it did is gave them a set of management principles which have demonstrated their ability to withstand any amount of disconfirming evidence. And the third thing it did was give them a ticket to a job where they could learn something about management. And it's the third thing which makes the education justified. But the rest of it is sheer nonsense. Okay? Yeah.
At our location, we recently had a scenario where NASA called on a Wednesday and said that on that Friday, all work were to cease and the contract was dead, basically. In that scenario where there was like around 200 people affected, using this theory, what would be the most appropriate approach in that scenario?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the whole question. About 200 people. 200
people worked for a particular program.
Right.
And that program was canceled and was given 2 days' notice.
Well, what I'm saying is the manager of that program has a responsibility for finding employment for those 200 people. And if he thinks about it, he can always do it. I've never seen a case where it couldn't be done. But it requires a different way of thinking. What happens now is it's easy. We'll just get rid of the 200 people, wipe it out, our costs go down, and we'll be fine. So that's the temptation. But in the long run, it doesn't work. And, the Wall Street Journal showed that. That's not a radical observation. They showed that in 80% of the downsizing, costs go up within 2 years. Look what happened to Scott Paper and Sunbeam. There's beautiful examples. When, what's his name? Yeah, it was Chainsaw something. Chainsaw Al. He destroyed Scott Paper. It had to be bought in order to survive. And then he was hired by Sunbeam. What did he do to Sunbeam? He downsized it out of existence. Any others? Yeah, let's take it.
In your comments about reaching consensus, you laid out an example where basically people produce a rate efficient, a mutually beneficial solution. But now, what about decision making when there are not necessarily mutually beneficial outcomes, or where you're beginning to deal with allocations where one person would be made worse off by certain decisions?
See, one of the things that management ought to learn, but they never do because no business school teaches it, is how to get consensus. Let's assume I'm a manager and I have a committee of my subordinates that shares with me decision-making responsibility. It should operate by consensus, but you don't always get it easily. In about 80% of the cases, you'll reach consensus normally. But when you don't, there are a couple things that you can do. And I'm not going to take you through them right now. If I have time, I'll come to them later. But let me just tell you the extreme case. Extreme case is where no matter how much discussion you have, you cannot get agreement. The method of dealing with that was actually developed by August Bush III. It was in one of his sessions that we had set up with 11 corporate vice presidents. They couldn't reach agreement on an issue. And August said, stop. You're repeating yourselves. I want to go around the room and each one of you summarize your position in no more than 2 minutes. And so he started, took position A, you took B, you disagreed with him. You took A or B or C or whatever it is. We go around the room and the differences are perfectly clear. Then August said, if you don't agree, when I go back around the room, I'm going to act and this is what I'm going to do. But if you agree, whatever you agree on, I will do whether it agrees with me or not. Now they go around the room. If he says A and he says B, now they're in complete agreement. What happened? What are they agreeing on? They're agreeing on my position. Because they either agree with me or agree with each other. That's the options they're given. Now, the beautiful thing about that process is I've never seen a case where people didn't think that was fair. We've got to do something. And if we can't agree, how should we decide? They agree on the process to be used. The consensus is on that process. All right, let's take,
You wrote Recreating the Corporation in 1999. How's your thinking changed since you wrote that book?
Since which book?
Recreating the Corporation.
Oh, it hasn't changed in any fundamental way. It's still relevant.
Do you see companies adopting it?
Some have, yeah, I keep hearing about some that do, and they adopt parts of it. There are some that have adopted the whole thing. I give you some companies that have taken it lock, stock, and barrel and gone through the whole process. We just had a wonderful one. A little company in the Midwest called North Coast Energy. It was owned by a Dutch company, and it was in serious trouble. So the Dutch company picked a young man who was born in Turkey but educated in Holland and sent him over to set the company right. His name was Omer Yonel. He did a couple of interesting things. He came over and he fired all managers in the company, literally, and spent the first couple of months just hiring new people that he brought in from the industry under much better conditions than they had in their other jobs. And he formed a new management. And then he took this book as his Bible and started that process. They just sold that company, the Dutch company did. When he started, shares were $2.25 a share. They went up to $15.50 in 1 year as a result of changes that they produced using that book. I wish all of our cases were that easy to support, but okay, yeah.
Can creativity be taught? And because the question I'm asking,
Yes.
It looks like leadership, one of the most important ingredients of
Yes.
leadership is creativity. And the other reason I'm asking it is because in our schools now, in elementary and middle schools, they're teaching students how to control their impulses.
They're what?
Their impulses.
Oh,
Now, it seems to me that if you control your impulses, you become less creative because creativity requires impulsive thinking sometimes. Is that correct?
schools are, one of the terrible things in society. They're destroying our population gradually. I had an experience, my daughter is now in her middle 40s, but when she was about 13, she came home from school one night. She said, we have an extra credit problem in mathematics. And she showed me the 9-dot problem. You know the 9-dot problem? And it had typewritten instructions. It said, take a pen or a pencil, put it on one of the 9 dots. and without lifting your pen or pencil from the paper, draw 4 straight lines that cover all 9 dots. She said, I can't do it, can you help me? So I looked at it, and I said, you know, I did this when I was a kid, but I don't remember the solution. I said, look, it's an extra credit problem, so I've got a lot of work to do. Go ahead and forget about it. Well, she went into the next room and started to cry. Well, that disturbed me, so I went in and I said, what's the matter? She said she felt ashamed not to have the solution to that problem, so I told her to come back in the room. And I said to her, Karen, do you know the difference between a puzzle and a problem? She said, a puzzle is harder than a problem. I said, oh no. I said, there are problems you can solve, and there's nothing harder than that. Some puzzles are easy. Try again. He said, well, a puzzle has only one solution. I said, no, there are many puzzles that have lots of solutions. I said, try again. She said, no, I give up. You tell me. I said, well, a puzzle is a problem you can't solve because of something you incorrectly assume. And I took the sheet of paper with the 9 dots and held it up, and I said, for example, I said, you assume you can't fold the paper. What happens if we fold the paper? Well, we immediately found the solution to the problem. Now, that's not the point of the story. The next day in school, I came home that night. My daughter was there. I said, what happened in school when you showed your solution? She said, I don't want to talk about it. I said, why not? She said, you're going to get mad. I said, yeah, I can tell I'm going to get mad. But I'm not going to get mad at you. She said, you promise? I said, yeah. She said, the teacher asked the class who had a solution to the 9-dot problem. About 10 kids raised their hand, she said. She called on one of the other girls and asked her to come to the front of the room, and she's the one that went outside the square and showed how she did it. And my daughter showed me. I said, oh my God, that's the solution I knew when I was a kid. I said, then what happened? She said the teacher patted the girl on the head, told her thank you, and went on to another subject, but I raised my hand. The teacher said, what's the matter, Karen? She said, I have a different solution to the problem. The teacher said, there isn't another solution to the problem. Don't waste the class's time, Karen, and went on talking. My daughter raised her hand again. What is it this time, Karen? And it better not be that problem, because if it is, I'm going to put you out of the classroom. My daughter said, I'm sorry, Miss So-and-so, but I do have another solution to the problem, and I know I do, because my father showed it to me, and he's a university professor. Teacher said, I don't care who your father is. There's one solution, and you've seen it. My daughter said, I can do it with one line. And the class came apart. One line, you know, up to now the class was bored stiff in this conversation between my students. But one line. The teacher was sufficiently embarrassed. She said, all right, Karen, come to the blackboard and show your solution with one line. My daughter said, I can't do it on a blackboard. I need an easel and a pad. Why, said the teacher. My daughter said, I'll show you. So she got an easel and pad. My daughter, little tiny girl, drew the 9 dots to form a square. And then she began to fold the paper. And the teacher said, wait a minute, what are you doing? She said, I'm folding the paper. The teacher said, you can't do that. My daughter said, why not? The instructions didn't say I can't. The teacher said, I don't care what they said. That's what I meant. Now you sit down. See? That happens one way or another all the way through school. You are told that you are right if you give them the answer they expect. But creativity is always giving an answer they don't expect. Let me give you one more example. It was absolutely marvelous for me. I taught only graduate students for years. Their handwriting is terrible. I never give examinations. I had term papers, and I couldn't read half of them. So one year I decided, it's an end of it. I said, you're going to have to hand in your term papers, typewritten, double-spaced, about 8.5 by 11 sheets of unlined paper with 1-inch margins around 4 sides. Is that clear? Everybody said yes. I got a beautiful set of papers at the end of the year. But one of them They were all, typed on paper, but one of them was typed this way. At the end, it said, "Gotcha, didn't I?" So I said, God, he knew damn well what I wanted. I'm going to flunk him. And then I stopped. I said, just think of what he did. He sat there and thought about what he could do that I didn't expect. That's marvelous. I gave him an A+ with a note. Said, the next time you do it, it won't be creative. So we destroy creativity in school and at home. And this book by Jules Henry that I told you about, called Culture Against Man, he has a beautifully simple statement. We kill creativity with love. We teach kids not only to give us answers we expect, but don't ask questions we don't want to answer. What's so good about monogamy? Why is God a male with a beard? Henry has a whole list of these questions that kids have that they are taught not to ask. I was sitting in a living room with one of my colleagues who's one of the world's leading historians of science. Had a 4-year-old son. We're sitting on 2 chairs separated by a fireplace that's blazing away, and the little boy is standing there between the two of us looking up at the mantel. He breaks into the conversation, says to his father, "Daddy, what's time?" God, what a profound question. His father says, "It's what the clock measures." Little boy stands there a while. He said, "What does the clock measure?" His father said, "Look, John, I don't have time right now. Come back later." What's a kid learn? That's a question you don't ask adults, because they don't know the answer and they're not going to admit it. See? And you learn that all the way through school. So you limit the questions that can be asked, the answers that can be given, and we say, what happens to creativity? God, we're killing it every day. That's what's happening to it. Yes.
I have a question about downsizing, and recently there's been a lot in the news about the incredible increases in productivity, which is keeping the job market from increasing. So to what do you attribute that productivity?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last part.
How do you account for the amazing increases in productivity that we're seeing that are preventing the job market from improving?
Well, the accounting for it is simple. We're just so inefficient that almost any fool can improve it. You look at almost any process, and it's just unbelievable how inefficient it is. Last Friday, in my office, one of my colleagues found an error in the bill he got from AOL. It took 45 minutes for him to get to somebody that he could talk to about the mistake in the bill. Now, I don't have to be brilliant to know that that's stupid. So how do I increase their productivity? Any fool can do it. They just have to want to do it. Now, there's more than that. Of course, there's some creativity that comes in as well. There are people who remain creative despite what the system is doing to them. And they're the people you want to get. I wrote an article a while back. This was marvelous. There's a fellow at DuPont who was absolutely unique. He reported to nobody, had no boss. His job was to come up with ideas, any idea for the company. Well, he's the guy that was responsible for synthetic fibers, by the way. Subsequently responsible for what are called smart materials. So I was asked by the CEO, how do we describe this guy? So I wrote an article about him, and I called him the C-O-R-P jester. Because the role he plays is exactly the role of the court jester in the medieval court. He's a critic of authority who always does it with humor and clearly has no ambition to take the authority's place, who gets his enjoyment and kicks out of showing the deficiencies in the authority's behavior. We need that in corporations. We need corp jesters. okay? I've since found 2 or 3 other corporations that have somebody to play that role, and some that use outsiders to perform this function. When I stop and reflect, I've worked in over 400 corporations in my lifetime. That's really been my principal role. And it's only because they know damn well I don't want a job there that they will tolerate listening to it. Now, a lot of them reject it, but some of them accept it. Yeah.
I was reading your 6 points, and in reading them, I understand also something that is, what kind of leadership do you see is required? You mentioned, for example, the ability to influence. You also mentioned about educating, the workforce as opposed to mandating. And I'm wondering about what other attributes do you see that are significant in leadership to bring about the types of changes that you are denoting?
Yeah, well, I tried to indicate what some of them are, but the main problem you have to overcome, one of them I'm going to talk about, but the other one is that there's a law that management follows. And the law is the higher you rank, the less need there is for you to learn anything new. That's absolutely false. It's exactly the opposite. How many times have you ever heard of CEOs going to a course like this or a lecture like this? It's always the lower level people who are expected to go. But the people who need it the most are the people at the top because they're the obstruction. So you have to get to them in some way. And this is the great value that Charles Handy, that I mentioned in England, or Peter Drucker in the States have. They have access to top authorities. And I've worked with Peter Drucker. Recently, he and I were both at General Motors together, and it's marvelous to be with him working. Because when he talks, they listen. Unfortunately, they don't do anything about it, but they listen. And he gets as frustrated as I do from it. He's an old friend. Okay. Take one more and then we're going to break. Okay.
You mentioned that the average person uses around 23% of their relevant skills for a particular position. What approaches or tactics can be used to increase that skill base?
Yeah. Well, there are 2 things. One is there's an old saying, it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. So you stop asking if you can do something, you do it. And if they don't like it, they can get rid of you. That's their option. Your option is do you do it or don't you do it. I had, at Case Institute of Technology, I had an incredible president, Keith Glennon, who was the first head of the Space Authority, the National Space, and also the first head of the Atomic Energy Commission. He was a brilliant man. And he called me in one day. I'll never forget this conversation. He said, "You've been here a couple years, and I don't have the foggiest idea what the hell you're doing." He said, "I'm not here to tell you you have to let me know, but you better not screw up, because if you do, I'll have your ass." That's the kind of boss I want. You can do whatever you want to do, and as long as it works, I won't bother you. But if you make a mistake, I'm going to be at you. August Bush had a wonderful slogan up around the company. It said, if you didn't make a serious mistake last year, you didn't do your job because you didn't try anything new. But if you ever make the same mistake twice, you won't be here next year. That's the kind of atmosphere you want to work in. Not if you make a mistake, we're going to kill you. You can tell education is such nonsense. Just think about it. You take an examination, it comes back graded, right? All the things that are wrong are marked. Now, if they were really interested in learning instead of teaching, what would they do with the examination? They give you the same exam back 2 weeks later to find out if you've learned anything from your mistakes. But they don't. A mistake is something which is done, unforgiven, bang, let's go on to the next set of mistakes. But the simple fact, as I'll try to show you later, is the only thing you can learn from is mistakes. You can't learn from doing something right because you already know how to do it. But education is built on the assumption that mistakes are something you hide, forget about, or pretend you're unaware of. We were talking about Eastman Kodak before. They didn't buy Xerox when they could have for $11 million. They didn't buy Fuji when they could have. You try to find out who made that decision. You can't. It's hidden. It's hidden from the people that made it even. And if you can't identify mistakes and correct them, you can't learn. Okay, it's about time for lunch. We'll have another period for questions. We can catch them all later, okay? Somebody during the break raised the question. I told you that you can't teach leadership, and somebody asked me why. It was a good question. It's because leadership is a talent, and you cannot teach a talent. You either got it or not. You see, I can teach you how to draw, but I can't teach you how to be an artist. If you are an artist, I can improve your artwork by giving you some teaching. But I can't make an artist out of you if you don't have the talent. I can't make a composer out of you if you don't have the talent. I can teach you how to compose music, but I can't make a composer out of you. So in architectural school, when I went there, they taught us all how to draw, but they didn't teach any of us to be a great architect. Because it takes the talent that a Frank Lloyd Wright or a Mies van der Rohe or Walter Gropius had to do that. What you can do is give a manager some of the tools and techniques that make leaders better leaders if they use them than if they don't. But it's absolutely false to say, you send a manager to our school and we'll make a leader out of him. You can't do that. Now, I gave you these 6 things that are required for a transformation. It would take us at least 2 graduate courses to cover all of them in any detail. But since you're exceptional, I'm going to try to cover them in the next hour or 2. Obviously, we can't get into them in depth, but enough so that you'll have some good questions, I hope, about each one of them. The last time I was here, I spent most of the time on this one subject, systems thinking, what it is, and why it's so important. I started, if you recall, with a wonderful quotation from Einstein. Some of you may remember it. It said as follows: we cannot solve the problems created by our current pattern of thought using our current pattern of thought. I've never found anybody who disagreed with that statement, but it's very rare that I found anybody that understood it. It's very easy to agree with something you don't understand. See, a part of the new age is our way of thinking is undergoing a very fundamental change. And it's a change from analytic to synthetic thinking. And last time we spent a lot of time going through that transformation, but let me just very quickly summarize what that difference is. Analysis is a method of thought introduced to the Western world in the Renaissance. It became the method of science and became synonymous with thought in the Western world, and for 400 years, analysis is thinking. It's the same. If 2 people have a problem, one says, I analyze it, and the other one says, I thought about it. I ask a third person, what's the difference between what they did? You couldn't tell me, because analysis is thinking. Analysis is a 3-step process that comes to us naturally. If you want to understand something, the first thing you do is take it apart. The second thing you do is try to understand what each one of the parts do. And the third thing is you try to aggregate the understanding of the parts into an understanding of the whole. So if you go to a business school where they want to make you understand the corporation, first thing they do is take it apart. Production, marketing, finance, personnel, and so on. Then you try to understand each of the parts taken separately. And then hopefully, if the school's got any conscience, it will try to integrate that understanding of the parts into an understanding of the whole. Now, the reason I call this transformation of age the systems age is because the concept system, when it arose into consciousness in the 1950s, made it apparent that there are a very important class of problems that analysis cannot solve. It's called the paradox of analysis. For example, if you may remember, I used 2 examples when we were here last time. I asked the people, how many of you have ever been in England? All of you have been in England, raise your hand. Oh, good. Then you all know that the British drive on the wrong side of the street. Why? I'll give you all the British cars you want, and you can take them apart from now to doomsday, and it won't tell you why they drive on the left side of the street. No reason. The American car, when it developed in this country as a mass-produced vehicle, was a 6-passenger vehicle. Why? Why wasn't it 4, 2, 15, 9? Why 6? Do you think taking the cars apart will tell you why it was 6? Why did the automobile have the motor in front? Does taking it apart tell you why it's in front? No. What we discovered is there's something about a system which makes it impossible to understand it by taking it apart. So, if I want to understand a system, I got to do something other than analyze it, and we discovered that's a different way of thinking called synthesis. And synthesis is exactly the opposite of analysis. In the first step of analysis, you take the thing that you want to understand as a whole to be taken apart. The first step of synthesis, you take the thing you're trying to understand as a part of a larger whole. So in the first step of synthesis, I want to understand a corporation. I say it's a part of the economic system. Or a school, it's a part of the educational system. The second step of analysis, you try to explain the behavior of the parts taken separately. In the second step of synthesis, you try to explain the behavior of the containing whole. What's the behavior of the educational system, the economic system, and so on. In the third step of analysis, you try to aggregate the understanding of the parts into an understanding of the whole. In the third step of synthesis, you disaggregate the understanding of the containing whole into the function and performance of the parts. Understanding of the behavior of an entity depends on your understanding of its function in the larger system of which it's a part. Why was it a 6-passenger car? It was designed for the average American family, which was 5.6. Why is it getting smaller? The average American family is now 3.2. See, the explanations don't lie in the vehicle, it lies in the function it's performing in society. Why did the British drive on the wrong side of the road? Because they built the roads during the medieval period when the principal form of travel was a horse. What side do you mount a horse from? Left. If you want to mount a horse on a road and stay out of traffic, which side of the road would you have the horse on when you mount him? The left. So they rode on the left. The carts followed the horses. Interestingly, when the British came over to this country to settle it, they drove on the left. But a bright young man one day got tired of that for a very good reason. The brake on the cart is outside the cart, so the right arm, which is a strong arm, can pull the brake on, puts the shoe against the wheel so it won't move when you stop. It was raining and he got his arm wet. He said, that's silly. Why don't I move the brake inside so it's under the cover, and when I pull it on, I won't get my arm wet. The problem was he now had to use his left arm to put the brake on. Most of you are too young to remember, but even in my youth, left-handedness was considered to be possession by the devil. Literally true. In my school, in elementary school, you were not allowed to write with your left hand. Didn't make a damn bit of difference whether you're left-handed or not, because that was conceding to the devil. So the left arm was not a good arm to put the brake on. So he said, I got to fix it up so I can use my right arm to put the brake on. Well, that was easy. Just move the driver over to the other side of the brake. The driver is now sitting on the left. The brake is on his right and it's out of the rain. But he has a new problem. He can't see around the cart in front of him. Well, how can he change things so he can see around the cart in front of him? Move the cart over to the right from the left. And so we drove on the right instead of the left because we were not mounting horses to go down the highway. The explanations always lie outside the system in the role or function that something performs. Now, there's a much more important reason than the examples reveal. A system is a whole that's defined by its function in a larger system, as I said, and has at least 2 essential parts, and each essential part can affect the behavior of the whole, but the way it affects the whole always depends on how other parts are behaving. It's the interaction of the parts of a system that define the behavior of the whole. Now, some incredible properties of a system which we discovered when we started to think about them. For example, no part of a system can perform the defining function of the system of which it's a part. No part of an automobile can carry you from one place to another. The body can't, the axles can't, the wheels can't. And moreover, when you take the system apart, therefore, you break the interactions of the parts and you lose the functioning of the whole. But you also lose the functioning of the parts. And this is the incredible, important finding. See, if I take an automobile and disassemble it in this room, I could do it. But keep every part in this room, I don't have an automobile. Got the parts of an automobile, I don't have an automobile. The automobile is the interaction of its parts, not the sum of its parts, right? But when I take it apart, not only does the automobile lose its function, but also its parts do. See, a car can't move without a motor. Everybody knows that. But when I disassemble a car and put the motor on the floor, what can it move? Not a damn thing, it just sits there. By taking it out of the system, it's lost its essential properties. You can't think without a brain. But if I do a little surgery on you and take your brain out and put it on a table, it doesn't sit there and think. You think, your brain doesn't. When a system is disassembled, it loses all of its essential properties, and so do its parts. Now look at what a business school does to you when you go there to learn how to run a corporation. What's the first thing they do? Take the corporation apart. And then they study each of the parts in isolation, because the marketing department is not going to talk about how marketing interacts with finance and personnel. That would be a traitor. You're being disloyal to the flag that you follow under marketing. So we've developed silos in corporations, vertical slices with no interaction between them. And the net result that people come out of business school with not only not understanding what a corporation is, they don't even understand what production and marketing and finance and personnel are. Because what's important about marketing is how it interacts with the other functions, not how it acts separately, but how it interacts with them. Because the performance of the whole depends on the interactions, not the actions taken separately. So I used the previous example, put a Rolls-Royce motor in a Toyota or a Honda, you don't get a better car. You get a better motor, but a worse car. It's the way the parts interact that determine the performance of the whole. So we have to start to learn. The most important thing a manager can learn about the organization he manages, how do its parts interact? I'm going to show you why as we proceed. As I just said, improving the performance of the parts of a system does not necessarily improve the performance of the whole. It can destroy it. And I use the architectural example, remember, with the dumbwaiter in the kitchen. Now, here's another consequence. There's no such thing as a production problem. No such thing as a management problem. No such thing as a marketing problem, a financial problem, a religious problem, a health problem, an economic problem, a social problem. There are no such things. But all through school, you're taught that there are. Why? Because that's the way a school is organized. Now, I'm going to let you in on a secret. Experience is not organized the way a school is. You see, problems do not fall in the categories the way schools put them. Those adjectives in front of the word problem don't tell you one damn thing about a problem. They tell you something about the person looking at the problem, and that's an entirely different thing. So when somebody says that's a medical problem, you can be sure he's a doctor. Says an economic problem, he's an economist, because that's the only kind of problem they can see. They have tunnel vision, and they see things within discipline, but experience doesn't come in disciplines. I used an example last time, which those who were here will forgive me for repeating again because it's the best one I've ever come across. In the so-called urban black ghetto that we were working in just north of the university, during one of our meetings with community leadership, a member of the community came in with a piece of news that stopped the meeting dead. There was an 83-year-old woman who lived in a neighborhood who had made a major contribution to the self-development effort. She had organized what we called the geriatric set, the older people in the neighborhood, and they'd done some unbelievable things. They organized 3 infant care centers, not child care centers, but infant care centers. They took babies 3 months old, kept them or 3 years old, and then they could go to a daycare center. By the way, more than 50% of the 3-year-olds coming out of the infant care centers were literate. Okay? Unbelievable. They did it so mama could go back to work or go to school. They planted trees throughout the neighborhood. They cleared empty lots that were rubbish heaps. They removed graffiti, did all kinds of great things. And we were finally able to do something for that woman. She had a bad heart. But there were no medical facilities in Mantua. Mantua was 80 city blocks with 22,000 people in it, without a single medical facility within the neighborhood. The closest one was a hospital as part of the University of Pennsylvania called the Presbyterian Hospital, 2 miles from where she lived, and she couldn't walk 2 miles. There was no public transportation because at the time it was unsafe to run public transportation in the neighborhood. The muggings were too frequent at that time, back in the 60s and 70s. What had happened? We opened a health clinic in the middle of the neighborhood, converting an old house, and the hospital, the University of Pennsylvania, populated it with doctors and nurses on a voluntary basis. And so for the first time in her life, she could come once a month for a checkup. She'd go in that morning, they gave her an EKG and a minor stress test. She passed them all, they sent her home. On the 3rd flight of stairs, returning to her home, which was on the 4th floor of a big old house, she had a heart attack and died. That was the news that was brought to us. There was a silence in the room. The first one to speak was Sam Martin, a professor of community medicine. He said, "Damn it, I told you we don't have enough doctors in the clinic. If we had more doctors, we could make house calls, and if we could make house calls, this never would have happened." Now that's perfectly obvious, so nobody had any comments on it. There was a lull, and then the professor of economics spoke up, and he turned to the professor of community medicine and said, "Sam, there's no shortage of doctors. They're not at the clinic, but they're all over the city. Trouble is they're private practitioners and she couldn't afford one. Now, if her welfare payments were larger, or if we had a national health care plan, she could have got a doctor to come to her." That was equally true. Another silence followed by the professor of architecture who said, "Why don't we make them put elevators in those buildings?" Finally, the only woman present, a professor of social work, spoke up. Shook her head and said, "What a pity. You don't know a damn thing about that woman, do you? You don't know that she was married as a teenager and shortly thereafter gave birth to a son. She was simultaneously deserted by her husband, whom she never saw again during her lifetime. She raised that son with loving care by doing menial housework, and the son was brilliant. He graduated from public schools in Mantua and competed for the mayor's scholarship, won it, and got a fully paid scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania. He graduated with a degree in arts and science at the top of his class and got a scholarship to the law school. He graduated from the law school at the top of his class and was hired by the largest law firm in Philadelphia. He is now a senior partner in that law firm. He's married, has 2 children, and lives in a beautiful home out on the main line, which happens to be all on 1 floor. Now, if she hadn't been alienated from her son, she would be living with him where she'd have all the money she needs and no steps to climb. Now, here's your midterm examination question. Is that a medical problem, an economic problem, an architectural problem, or a social work problem? None of the above. It's a problem. Those things tell you the point of view of the person looking at the problem. Now, what's the point of all that with regard to management? Well, let me take a place where we act rationally, with headaches. Is there anybody in this room that never had a headache? Good. When you get a headache, what do you normally do? Brain surgery? That'd be ridiculous, isn't it? Now stop and think, why is it funny to suggest brain surgery? Because that's where the pain is. It's because you understand the way the system works. And so you say, there must be an easier way to get to the pain center of the brain than doing surgery. So I'll take a pill that contains a chemical and swallow it. It will dissolve in the stomach. The bloodstream will absorb the chemical and carry it up and deposit it on the brain. I don't do any surgery. And it works in a couple of minutes, no after effects. Because somebody understands the interaction of the system, you learn how to enter a system where you can have the biggest bang for the buck. But management doesn't. Management finds a place of getting the biggest buck for the bang. A manager of marketing comes in the morning and he finds out the sales in the Northeast has gone down by 15% in the last quarter. Uh-oh, he says. I got a management problem in marketing. I got a marketing problem. He now tries to solve the problem by manipulating the variables under his control, marketing. And that's why he calls it a marketing problem. Now, I've worked, as I said, in over 400 corporations on thousands of problems, and I can tell you in over 90% of them, the best place to solve a problem is not where they appear. It's in some other part of the system, which through interactions gives you the best access to the problem. But there we go. We insist, because we have silos, on solving a problem where it appears, and it's almost always inefficient to do that. It's only by understanding the interactions of the system that requires a different kind of organizational structure, because organizations are designed for vertical slices. Last time I used a detailed example of a paper company. I don't want to spend all the time going into it, but just briefly, it's a paper company located in Hamilton, Ohio, that produces the largest producer of coated papers in the United States. These are very high quality papers used in art magazines and art books to take color photography. It's a plant with 8 continuous production lines, assembly lines. And because they had diminishing sales, they started to add products to the product line. When they started, they had 2,700 products that they made, and they wound up with 3,200. When they did that, as a result of that, production went down by about 20%. And so the vice president of production did a study and found out that the equipment was as efficient as it ever had been. There was no more downtime for repair and maintenance. And he found the reason for the reduction in productivity, the increased number of products. If you have a fixed production facility and have to make more products on that facility, you have shorter and more production runs. It's the only way you can get them all made. Which means the time between production runs increases. Because every time you take a product off the production line and want to put a new one on, you got to adjust the equipment. That's called setup time. So he found, by charting it, that setup time went up in the plant exactly as productivity came down. There was his headache. And so he asked us if we could schedule production so as to minimize setup time. Can you do brain surgery? We were pretty naive in those days, I guess still are, because we said, yes, we can do that. That's a well-known problem in network theory, and there's an optimal solution to scheduling. But the improvement you can get depends on how accurately you can forecast demand. Because if you have a lousy forecast, it doesn't make a difference how well you produce for it, you're still not going to make money. But if you have a reasonably good forecast, then the good scheduling method will save you a lot of money. You say, well, how can I find out how much I can save? You say, well, we can do it in the following way. We'll do a simulation of your factory on a computer. We'll go back for 5 years and assume we had a perfect forecast of demand, which of course we didn't have. But we know what you sold, so we'll assume we had a perfect forecast. We'll use the new scheduling method, and we'll calculate how much you could have saved. If that turns out to be a small amount, then it's not worth going after. If it's a big amount, then it's worth going after. We can never get it all, because we'll never have a perfect forecast. But maybe by improving the forecast and using the new scheduling method, we get a big saving. He said, that's a good idea, go ahead and do it. So we went ahead to do it. And in the course of doing it, we made this discovery that shocked us. 8% of the products accounted for 100% of the profit and 90% of the production. Why? The company had been organized in 1812, and the family that built the company had a slogan: they will never discontinue a product offered to customers. They guaranteed availability of any product they made to perpetuity. So you had a whole bunch of products that hardly ever sold. So we came back to the manager and said, look, you got this problem because you added 500 products to the product line. You can get a lot bigger saving by reducing the product line than you can by improving production. He said, damn it, I knew you were going to come up with something like that. No, he said, you can't do it. We said, why not? He said, that's marketing's responsibility. We said, that's great. We work for marketing. Let us go talk to them. He said, no, you can't, he said. Well, why not? He said, if you go talk to them to ask them to help me solve a production problem, they're going to think that gives them a license to come in here and tell me how to run this plant. And I don't want those bastards in here. Now, I'm sure you've heard this kind of thing before. We argued with him, but it didn't do any good. So we went back to working on the scheduling, but we cheated. We got a computer run of 3,200 products from the least profitable up to the most profitable. We got this huge accordion of IBM printouts. You remember those old sheets?